we all have a different baseline of what we find difficult. Maybe dealing with a difficult client, or a client that's being argumentative or a bit combative. That might come naturally to someone. That's part of their job. That's part of their day to day. They know exactly how to deal with that, and that doesn't faze them. But for someone else, that could be, that could be their catastrophic situation.
G'day, I'm Peter Anthony. Welcome to Growth Tales. Jonathan Cannon is a business psychologist with Lumina Learning in the UK. And today we're discussing resilience. Expect to learn why resilience is surprisingly hard to define, the role of personality in managing and coping with resilience, and why resilience is not like an airbag. Here's Jonathan's story. So we're talking about resilience today, and I was just reflecting on resilience and thought of the Buddha's Four Noble Truths. And number one is life is difficult.
Yeah.
Life is difficult. So we're thinking, if we accept that life is difficult, I don't think any of us that are alive understand our lives are difficult in the workplace. Resilience is obviously key, but one of the interesting things about resilience is, how do you define it? I mean, how do you define something as nebulous as resilience? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I think resilience, it's been overused. I think no one really knows. Well, people know how they define it, but everyone's defining it in slightly different ways. And it's one of those issues with such vague kind of terms that you throw around, innovation, resilience, volatile, or, whatever it is. It's everyone's got their own definition of it. And that means everyone's kind of think they're working towards the same thing when they come to, let's say, you want to build resilience within a team. Everyone thinks they're working in the same direction, but actually it's so vague and so intangible.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
It is. And you think, and part of that definitional problem is that you think, well, is it a trait? So is it stable? Is it a process that I go through, or is it an outcome I arrive at? What are your thoughts there?
I think the way I see it, it's most like it's a behavior for me, right?
Okay.
I was thinking about it this morning, actually, and I'm kind of going to make an analogy here to resilience being a bit like defensive driving. Do you know what that is?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. When you're driving, kind of assuming the worst is going to happen, assuming that other people on the road are going to do weird things that you don't expect, or they're going to drive a bit unsafely, or something is going to come out of nowhere. And so you, from your kind of baseline, you are assuming the worst. You're assuming for the worst to happen. You hope it never has to happen, but that's how you're kind of behaving in your day to day. That's how I see resilience a lot of the time, is that it's you assuming the worst is going to happen, and how are you going to deal with that external threat or that external danger?
Okay. So it's more like an explanatory style, or a way of thinking about things, or being prepared for an event, like a catastrophic event, or a bad event, if we can use that phrase, in my working life. It's having a set of skills or a set of competencies that allows me to deal with adversity. To get away from that difficult situation, to get yourself back to safety, or back to somewhere where you're comfortable. But if I think about, I said earlier, people define it in different ways. I think the major issue right now is that if I kind of extend that analogy to resilience being like an airbag in a car, right? Yeah.
The airbag is an essential part of the car. You need to have one in your car, because if anything does go majorly wrong, that's the thing that's going to save you, right?
Yes.
And that's how I think a lot of people and organizations think about resilience, is that it's always going to be there. You need to train people up to be resilient, whatever that means, so that when something catastrophic happens, it's going to be there to save you. But I don't think that's the right way of looking at things.
Yeah, I agree. And I think if it's only about catastrophes, it really partials out all the everyday challenges that we might face, because there's an underlying level of stress or an underlying level of challenges in all workplaces, and particularly people like you and I working with high performers, which by definition means there's challenge, there's uncertainty, there's challenge. So I need a set of skills, or a way of thinking about that, as well as catastrophe, because catastrophe is rarely going to happen in most businesses, is it? It's a rare occurrence.
It's a rare occurrence, but if it does happen, then you better be prepared for it. But you should be doing everything in your power to make sure it never gets to that point. And that's where those kind of smaller steps that you just mentioned, that's where they come in, where you need to be able to build up resilience to those little things that come up in the day-to-day, and see those as not just small inconveniences or small difficulties, but actually something that, when compounded, could turn into that catastrophic situation that you're trying to do everything you can to avoid.
Yes. And a lot of, I'm imagining too, that a lot of this resilience is about perception too, because people perceive challenges in different ways. So if I have different traits, I might perceive things in different ways, and I may be required to be resilient in different circumstances. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's we all have a different baseline of what we find difficult. So maybe dealing with a difficult client, or a client that's being argumentative or a bit combative. That might come naturally to someone. That's part of their job. That's part of their day to day. They know exactly how to deal with that, and that doesn't faze them. But for someone else, that could be their catastrophic situation. So recognizing what triggers us, the different things that could kind of force those kind of resilience, defense mechanisms to come up in each of us, recognizing they're completely different.
Yes. And if I'm a leader at an organization, like managing a team, resilience is going to be key. So one of the prescriptions we're talking about then is to understand that there's going to be different environments may trigger resilience, or the requirement for resilience in different environments. Yeah.
Yeah, and absolutely.
It's also, it's interesting too, the different sorts of environments resilience can be key in, because you think of major health networks need resilient environments. Big consulting firms or big legal firms are dealing with challenging client situations. You think major engineering firms, they need resilience because they're working to engineering tolerances, or you think of industrial mining environments or oil rigs. It's pretty much everywhere, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's so different. I mean, as you say, it's like, let's think 2 years back over the pandemic, people in healthcare needing to work through the pandemic and those difficult situations. The resilience there is very different to what's required when you're working on a building site or when you're working in an office. And I think the most extreme example that I've seen, actually, we worked with a client probably about a year or two back, and they were looking to send a team to Antarctica. Scientific research.
Yes, that's right.
So I think that is probably the pinnacle of an extreme environment where you actually need physical as well as kind of emotional or mental resilience, and everything is being tested at that point.
Yes, it's interesting too, because oftentimes, like if you're in an accounting or actuarial environment and everything is basically the same, and you pride yourself in following process and get very good at that, then there's a major change, like a major accounting system change or a major software or application change. There's suddenly a huge challenge in terms of shifting from one system to another. So it might be fair to say that resilience is key in almost any commercial or government environment. Yeah. Would you say?
It's just recognizing what resilience means in that context. Blanket views on resilience, or kind of generic, what they call resilience training, whatever that means. I don't think that ever works. When you're taking someone's definition of what resilience means and how to then train someone to be resilient, if you're kind of applying that across an organization, it's never going to work that well. Because, as you say, it's going to be hugely different depending on who the individual is, depending on what their baseline is.
It's hugely contextual. And are there gender differences in resilience? Has any work been done on differences between how men and women experience challenge?
If you look at, I think the most classic definition of resilience, if we kind of talk in terms of personality, right? We're talking in terms of the big 5 personality traits. So we've got openness, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and then the final factor is called neuroticism. Slightly more positively could be called emotional stability. Typically, that's the one that's the most kind of associated with the classic definition of resilience. So if we look at someone who's very emotionally stable in terms of their personality, we're seeing someone who's optimistic, confident, even-tempered, so not showing their emotions that much. And resilience is a big part of that. So being able to cope with pressure, kind of not letting their emotions dictate what they do when they're faced with that difficult circumstance, but being able to kind of self-regulate and be able to move on in a kind of logical way. So if we take that as the definition of resilience, yes, there are some differences that we see when we compare between groups, gender being one of them. typically speaking, women tend to be a bit less emotionally stable. Men typically are slightly more emotionally stable, but that's not to say that that's, I think, representative or accurate, because the issue that we see is that how those traits are defined can be quite biased.
Yes. It's incredibly contextual, isn't it? Which makes this a really interesting topic. It depends on gender, experience. You're referring then back to traits which are stable, and we're talking about resilience, which sounds like it's more an explanatory style, or the way I explain things to myself. Like when a situation happens, I'm at work and a major client decides to leave and work with a competitor, for example. There is a major technical change, as we talked about earlier, with accountants and those actuaries. That's going to be my level of resilience is partly my stable traits, and partly how I explain that to myself and others. How I explain that situation to myself. What does it mean? Yeah.
And I think one of the major issues with resilience training, or kind of trying to get people within an organization to be more resilient, is that it focuses a lot on it focuses a lot on the external factors. You focus on what caused that threat: a client leaving, a change, a difficult client, or an unexpected circumstance. You're focusing on that. You're focusing on something that, for the most part, is something that's already happened.
Yes.
So you can't change that. Even if it's about to happen, a lot of times it's out of your control. But what the training often omits, or I think doesn't really focus that much on, is getting people to recognize in themselves how they change when that difficult circumstance occurs. What happens when you move from that very comfortable, familiar side of things, when you're doing your job like you've done every day for the past however many years, right? You know how to do that very well. You're very comfortable and you're on autopilot. Then something else happens that questions or kind of shakes up that level of comfort for you. And the thing is that we're still on autopilot, but for a different reason. I think in an ideal world, you would be able to stop, recognize what's just happened, recognize what you're about to do when you're under pressure, being able to temper those kind of slightly overplayed traits, slightly kind of unhelpful behaviors. But what happens is that we stay in autopilot because now we perceive that threat as urgent. We need to deal with it immediately. We're thinking about how to solve it, right? So then we're still on autopilot and not thinking about how actually our internal state has changed, what our inner thoughts are, and we let that impact our behavior.
Yes. It reminds me, as I'm sure it does you too, one of Viktor Frankl's ideas about between the stimulus and the response, there's a gap. And the gap's your freedom to choose, and freedom to choose a different way of thinking about what's happening, and therefore potentially a different set of actions. Whether you take those actions immediately or whether you think about them for a little longer.
I think that's the thing with, if you look at kind of resilience training as it's delivered to an organization, it's always focused on how you can, as quickly as possible, move away from that difficulty, or kind of move past those initial thoughts and start tackling that difficult situation. It's all about solutions. But it's very rarely or not enough about recognizing in yourself how you get to that place, how you kind of taking Frankl's quote into consideration, how you take a pause, how you recognize what's happening to you, and then from there figure out how to get yourself back into a state so that you can effectively solve the problem as best you can, but then also maintain that kind of that well-being side of things as well, making sure that you're actually addressing those issues that are coming up within yourself before you then tackle that external issue.
Yes. And it's also likely too, Jonathan, that if that external challenge does take place, you're likely to be more stressed and potentially less capable of making the most informed, resourceful decision at that particular time. So that space may also mean time to reflect as a business, as a team, as an organization, as an individual, to say, hey, where are we? What does this mean? What could it mean?
Yeah, I think there is a balance to be struck there. I think in an ideal world, we'll always be going for the perfect solution, right? You always want to be able to take as much time as possible, realistically, so that you can come up with the best solution possible. But I think the issue is that when we're considering resilience, when we're considering the situations in which we need to draw on resilience, whatever that means for us, oftentimes it's because things are changing. So in those situations, actually, if you're chasing perfection in an environment that is changing, you're probably never going to reach it. Because by the time you've taken the time, as you've taken the time to reach that perfect solution, everything's already changed.
Yes.
So there's a balance to be struck there between taking enough time to make sure you're taking care of yourself, making sure you're not making decisions based on autopilot, overextended behaviors, but then also recognizing that if you're chasing perfection, everything's moved on already. So you need to kind of strike that balance.
And perfection's a great cure for happiness too.
Yeah.
It's a great cure. I think there's a book written with a title like that. That's certainly the case. So it sounds like resilience. It's challenging to define. It's very contextual to the organization and to the individual. So it's not one size fits all. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like it's something that is useful and almost necessary, because you'd be thinking, particularly in smart, challenging environments like most of us are in, resilience is going to be necessary. And it's interesting too, because you think you can't really measure how resilient you are until you've got challenge. If there's no challenge, there's no, like, I don't know how well my airbags work until I have a crash, right? Not that
you hope, and then you hope they do.
No, I hope they work. I hope they work. And I have done defensive driving courses. I was engaged by a client that it was mandatory to have defensive driving as part of the job description, if you like, because we're driving a long way between sites. Yeah. And it's very scary to drive at 100 kilometers an hour and then slam the brakes on, because you think, I've never done that. Yeah. I've never done that. I did feel more, I'm not sure if it was resilient, but I felt more confident. I thought, wow, I can still steer the car with ABS brakes. When I slammed the brakes on, I did feel more comfortable. I felt more comfortable in everyday driving because I knew that I could deal with like an extreme challenge, if you like. I felt more comfortable back in my zone, back in my regular boring driving.
But that's a very tangible thing, isn't it? You can practice those techniques when you're behind the wheel, when you're driving. But as you say, in an organization, you can't have a simulated catastrophic situation at work, can you? Even if you can, it's not the same.
No, it's not the same, and you won't respond the same emotionally, and like all those stressors and those chemicals and those explanatory styles won't kick in if it's just like a workshop style orchestrated event. So we've arrived at a definition, even though it is nebulous. Yeah, we think yes, it's important, and it's going to be important in every role. Yeah, and it was interesting too. I'm becoming a bit of a TikTok addict.
Yeah,
and I was
got that doom scrolling going on where you just can't stop.
So you be careful what you watch too much of, because you get a lot more of it. But there was an interesting. I don't know how it came up on my feed, but I saw a really interesting short from a guy called Niall Wilson. He's a UK gymnast, Olympic gymnast. Aware of him, yeah, he's very famous in the UK, and he was part of this TED talk. And he said, look, when he was quite young, like 11 or 12 years old, he decided it was bulletproof. And one of the reasons he feels he was so successful, apart from outstanding physical abilities in gymnastics, was that he thought he was bulletproof. And part of what ended his career was he got severely depressed. And desperately unhappy because he was almost too resilient. Yes, in his environment, and it became quite toxic for him because he had like toxic relationships. He had issues with alcohol and a whole range of things that he quite openly talked about during this TED talk. And I'm thinking at some levels, and I've coached executives like this too, like very senior people in big organizations, who I would argue are too resilient. They're too tough. They're too bulletproof, and they have issues connecting with people because they're so tough, and they have issues with seeming like they care because it looks like they don't. Yeah, because it's almost too much resilience.
And people don't really talk about that too much, is it? It's like almost like you can't have too much of a good thing to be able to apply that to resilience. I mean, you can never be too resilient. Everyone needs more, because there's always going to be a more difficult circumstance. But
yes. So one of our challenges is how much is enough. I mean, how much resilience is enough? Because clearly Not enough is going to mean I'm not as effective or happy as I could be in my environment. Too much is going to mean I'm going to potentially make bad decisions or be disconnected from the teams
or ignoring those kind of the negative impact the challenges are having on you emotionally and from a well-being perspective.
Yes. If you push it down for long enough, it's going to cause some health issues and emotional issues too. So you think, well, how much is enough? Because you're almost in some environments that I've worked in, being really tough is rewarded.
Yeah.
It's like if you don't show
not putting up with things and
if you're bulletproof, it's almost rewarded. Well, gee, Jonathan's bulletproof. Nothing seemed to affect him. We're going to promote him.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's why I say when there's that bias there, you're rewarding people who are, probably from a business perspective, more productive, able to affect that bottom line a bit more because they're able to repress those difficult situations, internalize them in some way, ignore them or whatever, and be able to move past it. But then, in the case of Niall Wilson, that comes at the expense of, in that case, a shortened career because there's a breaking point there.
Yes, there's an emotional. He had physical injuries as well, but he was also emotionally broken.
Yeah.
And this was only after 5 years of thinking that way, 5 or 6 years of thinking that way, which isn't that long. Because if you think about a professional career, often it's 20, 30, 40 years, not 5 years.
Yeah.
So if you think I'm pushing those feelings down for 30 or 40 years, it's going to cause some huge issues for me because I'm almost too resilient.
Yeah. And does it bleed into your personal life as well and affects relationships outside of work?
Yeah, and affects your overall level of happiness and well-being, which ultimately is why we do things. I mean, you think, well, if you keep asking, why do I do this? If you keep asking long enough, you think, I'm doing it to be happy.
And you see that in, if we're looking at high stress, let's say professions, if we look at frontline healthcare staff, paramedics, nurses, doctors, ER doctors, if we look at things like investment banking or some finance sectors, high pressure environments, we often see the most toxic cultures or unhelpful ways of dealing with things, higher rates of drug use, suicide, those kinds of things. And it's when, as you say, that over the top resilience or extreme levels of resilience are being rewarded or are absolutely necessary for the job that you're working in. If you're a paramedic and you're out on call if someone's been in a car crash, there is no time for you to be able to think about how that's impacting you from a mental well-being, take a time to pause and then be able to deal with the patient. You have to just act. And that's never ending.
And not feel anything. I was involved in a large industrial environment where safety was a big issue, as it is in most industrial environments.
Yeah.
And what they found was that one reason safety was an issue was that people were scared to speak up. Because there was a very, very much an autocratic, top-down bullies at the top, and the rest of the crew, who were the people who were most aware of any potential safety issues, were too concerned about their welfare and their jobs to speak up.
Yeah.
So it was almost a complete cultural change that was required, not just changing the individuals, but starting at the top.
Yeah.
And these were people that were rewarded for 20 or 30 years of not feeling anything.
Yeah.
Of being so resilient, they were almost toxic in their environments.
And that's the thing. I think that's a fault of how we have been able to define resilience, defining it as that putting on that blank exterior, being very tough through these challenges, being able to work through it, not show emotion. I think that is a fault of a lot of how we define resilience now. Thinking about that situation, someone speaking up to say, there is an issue here, or I need help with this, or there's something we need to be, that's a form of resilience in itself. That's, I'd argue that's probably even better than being able to put up with the issue, because there you're actually addressing it before it happens. You're asking for help. You're looking for support where you need it.
Yeah.
And why can't that be resilience?
Or even just showing concern. Like, I'm not sure it's a problem yet, but I'm just a bit concerned about this.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to speak up because the last guy that spoke up got fired. So I'm just going to keep it under my hat and just come to work and go home.
And how do you change that when it's inherent in the structure of the organization. It's inherent in the culture.
Yes.
If someone new comes into that environment, so we've done some research in a healthcare sector with an organization in healthcare, and they were trying to address issues of bullying, a very toxic work culture, right?
Yes.
And it was very similar to what you're describing. There's a very strict hierarchy. It's a very kind of entrenched culture within the organization that this is your place here. You are going to, this is your boss. These are your subordinates. There is a hierarchy.
Yeah.
You stick to it. You do not answer upwards. You respond to what they ask you to do, and you do it. And that's it, right? And there's a cycle of toxic cultures. There's a cycle of bullying that perpetuates forever.
Yes.
Because if someone new comes into that organization, starting at that bottom of that very strong hierarchy, they're receiving that toxic behavior from above them.
Yeah.
They need to put up with it because they need to be resilient in that environment, because they need to be able to do their job as a healthcare professional. They don't have time to have so-called drama with their colleagues or be able to raise issues, right? So they put up with it. What happens when they get promoted? That's all they know how to do. That's how they know how to manage their subordinates. So they become the bully. They become that toxic person within the hierarchy, and it never ends. It perpetuates.
Yeah, the culture gets inherited. It's how we behave, how we talk to each other, how we manage each other. That's true of a lot of major health and hospital networks in many parts of the world that I've experienced. It was a big surprise, a huge eye opener for me, because when I first started working in a health environment and getting involved there, I was thinking this is going to be full of very caring, loving people, which it is. Yeah. But I was shocked at how toxic it was.
Yeah,
and
that's
they knew
the issue. They are caring.
They are super caring people. So it must be extra stressful to be super caring, a healthcare worker, healthcare professional, wherever you are in that mix, be super caring to patients, and then and like turn it on and turn it off. That must be like extra stressful.
Yeah, it's almost like you need to have kind of two selves, like kind of two personas that you're putting on depending on the context. We look at personality and kind of our behaviors and how that's typically defined. Typically speaking, for an individual, you'd say that they have some sort of underlying motives, intrinsic values or preferences that they have, and that's fairly stable. You would say that they have more of an outward facing persona, how they behave every day, what they actually show to the world. That's slightly more variable, but generally speaking, if we're at home, we're one way. If we're at work, we're another way. But that's, within those contexts, they're fairly stable. But within high pressure environments, especially in healthcare, I think there almost needs to be two work personas that you're putting on, and you need to be able to switch them on and off as required. You need to be able to be that caring, loving, nurturing side of things when you're with a patient, or you need to be very resilient because you're dealing with a very urgent situation. But then when you're back in the office or you're working with your colleagues away from patients, that's another set of behaviors that you need to then be able to turn on to be able to survive in that environment.
Yes. And you're thinking that takes a lot of emotional capital, a lot of emotional resources.
Yeah.
Because you're thinking, I've got my underlying traits, like who I really am, if I can use that phrase.
In the perfect world.
Who I really am underlying. And then I've got how I tune things up or tune things down every day when I come to work. And I learned that. I'm in a hospital network. I'm in a big consulting firm and a big legal firm, wherever I might be. I've learned that that's my behavior. Like I learned if I'm in the construction or engineering environment, I learn not to speak up. If I'm in a big health network, I learn that bullying's okay. That's my everyday. And then I'm stressed. So I've got extra energy required.
Yeah.
Because I'm doing a lot of shifting.
Yeah.
A lot of moving around.
That emotional capital, the emotional labor of that and the energy that it takes is huge, but it depends, I think. And it depends on why we're changing. Everyone adjusts their behaviors every day, constantly, right? At work, if you're with a client, you're adjusting. If you're with a colleague, you're adjusting your behaviors. If you're at home with your partner, again, you're a completely different person. Everyone does that. Completely normal, right?
Yeah.
But most of the time, we choose to do that. We're able to make a decision that I'm going to be this way with this person, I'm going to be this way with this other person, and then when I'm back home, I'm going to be more of my underlying self. And that's absolutely fine. The issue comes when we don't have that freedom to choose. When we have to switch it on and off based on external factors, based on the fact that we are a paramedic on an urgent call, based on the fact that our colleague is, being unhelpful or slightly toxic in a workplace, we need to change, we need to adapt, not based on what we want to do, but based on what other people or the environment demands of us.
Yes.
And the biggest issue that we've done research recently on neurodivergence, and this is where we see a very drastic form of that kind of emotional labor. If we look at individuals with autism, there's a thing called camouflaging in autism, and those are kind of defense mechanisms to be able to assimilate to an environment, to be able to act in a way that other people think that you need to act, right?
Yeah.
That is not a conscious choice. That is seen as, if I could say, it's almost like a survival mechanism. You need to be able to do that in order to survive in this situation, in the workplace, in a social situation, or whatever it is. That's not a choice. You need to be able to do that. And that's where we see that emotional labor, when we're seeing that massive divergence between what someone wants to do or prefers to do or is naturally inclined to do versus what they actually have to do when it's not it's not their choice.
And one of the challenges of that emotional labor is it's likely to be correlated with higher stress levels. And one of the many insidious outcomes of high stress levels is poorer decision making.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm a senior person in any organization and I'm leading it, or I'm running a group of people that need to make smart, effective decisions, no matter what environment I'm in, I'm likely to get less effective decision making, as well as less happy, engaged employees. But if I just say for a moment, I don't care how happy they are, I care how effective they are, right? They're not going to make better. They're going to make poorer decisions because they're in a higher level of stress or distress than optimal. We don't want to be completely comfortable either. We're not saying, hey, let's just sit back and not make decisions and lie on the couch and drink lattes like that.
Sounds all right, to be fair.
It sounds okay. But that's also a good way to get really unhappy, is a lot of leisure.
Yeah.
There obviously is a degree of tension and a degree of stress, which is optimal. And Mihaly and Seligman talked about flow in that regard, where there's an optimal level there between challenge, my perceived level of skill, and my perception of the challenge. Because it doesn't really matter what my boss thinks the challenge is. It's how I perceive the challenge and how I perceive my ability to deal with it. And it's that gap where I need my resilience to manage it individually. It doesn't matter how resilient my boss is, really.
But I think the thing is that, resilience is, I think it's individual, right? It's something that you do in your own way. Everyone's resilient in their own way. But that doesn't mean that it's something that you need to do on your own, I think.
Yeah.
We ignore the fact that actually resilience can mean asking other people for help, having that support structure in place. And that is a form of resilience in itself. So just because resilience is something that I do in my way doesn't mean that therefore I need to use my way to solve this problem by myself.
Yes. I saw some interesting work there too on which it'd be useful to think about now, to think, okay, so what can we do about it? Like if I'm a leader listening to this, or I'm someone working in a stressful environment, so what can I do? And one of the pieces I saw that was really quite interesting was social support and social connection. If I feel supported in my workplace, I'm likely to deal with resilience better. If I feel like I can reach out to people, if I feel like I can share my concerns with somebody, like if I feel like someone cares about how I'm feeling or what I'm challenged by.
Yeah. That is, I think that's so important. And just yesterday, actually, I was at a conference in London, and the keynote speaker was a guy called Jonathan Van Tam.
Okay.
He was the deputy chief medical officer, I think, in UK government during the COVID pandemic. I think we can all agree that is probably an environment where that position needs a fair amount of resilience. It's probably the most difficult situation that anyone would have had to be in.
A health minister in any country during the pandemic would have been. You've got no preparation, no knowledge.
Nightmare.
Things are constantly changing.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
And
What was he saying about resilience?
he was saying something that I found, I think it applies to, it wasn't in the context of resilience, but I think that this is a form of resilience. And he was talking about being able to recognize your limits, being able to recognize where you can add value. So his background was in epidemiology, the scientific side of things, the medical side of things. That's where he can add value, right? But when it came to the policy side of things, the more political side of his role, he recognized that's probably not his strength when it comes to. He was focusing himself on the vaccination process, so being able to roll that out as quickly as possible. So being able to recognize where you can add value to this difficult situation, but then recognizing the people around you, where can they add value? So he was talking a lot about delegation. So being able to delegate up to his boss, so Chris Whitty, being able to delegate down to junior ministers who are more kind of experienced in various areas of dealing with this massive complication.
Yeah, so part of the antidote, if you like, is social support or support around you.
Support around you, but recognizing your expertise, recognizing where you're weaker, where you're stronger. I think a lot of the times when we're in that pressured situation, I think depending on your personality, is that the natural inclination a lot of the times is that I'm faced with this challenge, therefore I need to go and solve it. It takes too long to get other people involved. You need to explain the issue to them. You need to try and work out how you're going to work together on this. Therefore, you're going to go do it by yourself. But you need to recognize, actually, taking a little bit of time to involve other people, depending on what their strengths are, depending on where you're a bit weaker, actually could save you a lot of time in the long run, rather than you just kind of forging ahead on your own and trying to do everything.
So it may start with self-awareness then, like being self-aware of my skills, my competencies, my explanatory styles, and acknowledging my strengths, admitting where I might need support, and having the network around me I can trust and draw on, and they feel the same way, that we're operating that way.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think another thing as well is going back to what you asked a question before that I don't think we've properly addressed, and it's how much resilience is enough.
Yes, and we were talking about the Olympic gymnast. He had too much resilience.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I think how much resilience is enough is a great question, and I think to properly be able to kind of answer that, I don't think we can look at resilience as a spectrum of no resilience at all to too much resilience and say, you're somewhere along that line. I think we need to be able to look at it as two different forms of resilience that are most of the time independent of each other. There is the effective side of resilience. Those are when you recognize how you want to be resilient, where your personality can affect what type of resilience you have, how you cope with these situations, be it your social connections, drawing other people for help, or whether it's taking some time alone to think about it, or whether it is literally just going to a more solution-focused mode and solving the issue. Everyone can be effective at being resilient in their own ways. And I think that's very different from misguided resilience, what we think resilience should be. When in this case with Niall Wilson, the gymnast, I think, conjecture, I don't know, but it sounds to me like in his head, resilience is being able to put up with all these difficult situations, is being able to block out those negative emotions, the impacts on our mental health, and going too far with it. And I think those two things are very independent from each other. And it's often people who don't actually know how to be resilient in an effective way tend to be the ones who are also using resilience in the wrong way when it's required, because they don't know how to do it properly. They don't know how to do it in a safe way for themselves and for other people.
Yeah, it sounds like in a situation like his, he just blocks everything out, blocks out physical pain, blocks out emotional pain, and just moves into the challenge, which in a sporting environment is probably more likely than in a business environment.
Well, it's definitely a lot more visible.
Yeah, it's a lot more visible, and I have seen, particularly at very senior levels in big organisations, and some of the ones with like healthcare, policing, engineering, industrial construction type environments, big consulting firms. It's very common, but I think it's becoming. I think people are becoming more aware of the toxic outcomes. of over resilience or not enough resilience to where people are challenged. And we've talked about a couple of antidotes. One of them is self-awareness and being aware of who I am and how I respond to things and what I'm good and not good at. We've talked about like having social support around us. It seems too, Jonathan, that part of what you're saying is it's partly my explanatory style to how I explain things to myself. Like how do I explain it as a catastrophe?
Yeah.
Or do I talk about it as an event? Like if something happens in my environment, it's how I perceive it. And I love the work of people like Martin Seligman when he talks about explanatory style, and he says he talks about like 3 questions to ask, and one of them is how permanent is this, and look for the shortest possible like realistic time frame this is operating under. How pervasive is it? Like how widespread is it? Attempt not to catastrophize it, attempt to limit it as much as reasonably possible, and attempt to distinguish between what's externally and what's internally caused. Yeah. Like it's not my fault that this happened. Yeah. It's hard to blame myself for this happening. Yeah. If it's a pandemic, I didn't cause COVID.
No, right. But it's on you to fix it in that situation.
It's on me to fix it, but only in my very small world.
Exactly. Yeah.
From the health minister, maybe it's a much bigger issue, obviously, than for me. For me, it was just my family and my environment.
Yeah. Doing your part. Yeah.
Doing my part. So, is there anything else you'd suggest as antidotes? And I understand that you at Lumina Learning are planning to embark on some research in this space, because it is such an important issue, and it's one that's from a researcher's point of view, it must be challenging to research something like this.
Yeah, it's difficult, and I think especially as we are, I think from a personal perspective, I want to be able to kind of demystify resilience. I want to be able to move away from it being a kind of catch-all term for being able to put up with difficult things, right? Or that kind of classic definition of being able to put on a brave face, keep going ahead, not let your emotions rule you. I want to be able to move away from that. So one of the things that we're trying to do is look at how can everyone be resilient, right? Okay. How does it differ from individual to individual when we look at our coping mechanisms or the self-talk that's going in our head, the perception when we face difficulty? How does that differ from person to person? And how can everyone in their own individual ways be resilient? Moving away from that definition of resilient purely being emotionally stable, but moving towards how can someone who's more introverted be resilient? How is someone who can be a little bit less emotionally stable, a bit more responsive, how can they be kind of resilient in their own ways? And looking at more individually, what does that mean for people to be resilient?
Okay, so it would be, are you taking more a personality-based approach?
Yeah.
To say, depending upon my traits, I might need to be resilient in different ways or take different approaches to how I think and manage resilience?
I think there's 2 sides of it. There's definitely the personality side of things. How does our personality actually impact how we deal with difficult situations, how we be resilient in our own way? And that, I think, is driven by personality a lot of the times. A lot of our behaviors, a lot of the self-talk that we have, the inner dialogue is driven by our personalities. So I think the other side of it as well is looking at what triggers someone to require that resilience. Again, depending on personality or depending on the industry, it's looking at, for you, what causes you to need to be resilient is very different probably from what causes me to need to be resilient. So looking at those differences there, I think it's important to look at the individual and their personality, how that drives their resilience behaviors, let's call them, but then also those external factors as well. How does that differ from individual to individual?
And you're planning to do this research, cross industry?
Yeah, so I think we're gonna look at kind of across a wide sector of kind of industries and professions. I think it's important to recognize that some industries, like we talked about before, are inherently going to be very different, looking at those healthcare industries in particular. So I think we might do something separate there, kind of just recognizing that the context there can be very, very different to, more generic office work, for example.
Yes. Okay. Okay. And when is this research taking place, Jonathan?
So probably we're going to be kind of kicking it off within the next few weeks or so, but then it'll be kind of ongoing probably until the middle of this year or towards the third quarter. So yeah,
Okay.
it's not a small.
Wow.
It's not going to be a small piece of research. We're going to kind of break it up a bit.
I can't imagine it is. I'm thinking
No.
it's going to be an extremely challenging one. And if I could just ask you finally, I guess from two perspectives. If I'm a leader listening to this, I'm leading an organization or leading a team in an organization, and I'm concerned about building healthy resilience. What would be the one idea or one tip you'd give them?
I'd say the first thing, if you're a leader of an organization, you want to be able to build resilience within the organization. The first thing to do is for that individual to go, how do you define resilience, right? For themselves personally, how do you define resilience? Secondly, identify within the organization what circumstances come up that actually require resilience. What are you preparing for? You know, with the airbags, you're preparing for that car crash. With the defensive driving, you're preparing for someone to kind of cut in front of you, right? What are you preparing for? And then I think the most important thing is looking at the individuals within your organization and say, what's going to trigger certain people? Looking at all these possible catastrophes or difficult situations, these aren't going to affect people in the same way. So we need to start looking more at individual circumstances and what's going to trigger them to need resilience. And then from there, it's a lot harder, obviously, than taking a lot more generic approach and saying, this is how we are resilient within this organization. Yeah. Everyone gets trained in the same way. That's a lot easier, right? But we need to be able to take a more individualized approach, I think, to start looking at personal factors.
Yeah. It's easier in a way, but it's not going to work. I mean, I don't like looking at a resilience workshop or a change management workshop. It's highly contextual.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Yeah. To the environment, to the people. What about if I'm just a regular person?
Yeah.
I'm not a leader. I'm not the big cheese. I'm not running the show. I'm very happy in my role in the organization, but I'm under a lot of challenge. I feel like I'm under a lot of stress, and I would like to be more resilient in what I'm doing. I can't affect a company-wide resilience program. What would you suggest for them, Jonathan?
I think it's about, firstly, challenging those thoughts, challenging those perceptions. I think a lot of the times we conflate urgency with importance. We think just because something is urgent, therefore it's important, therefore we must get it done as quickly as possible, ignoring everything else. Sometimes that is the case. A lot of the times it isn't. So challenging that self-talk when something unexpected comes up, thinking, actually, is there cause to be stressed or feel under pressure or the need to be resilient here? Or actually, if you think about it a little bit and challenge yourself, actually, maybe you can take a step back, think about it from a more objective perspective and be able to move on from there.
Okay. So that's great advice. And it almost echoes what Frankl was suggesting to us, just to stop and just give it some context, give it some space.
Also challenge yourself. Don't believe the self-talk off face value.
No. Yes. I love that quote I read a few years ago, which was, just because you believe it doesn't make it true.
Yeah. I think this applies in actually both of these situations, right? For the individual and for the leader within the organization, is don't conflate opinion with facts, right? With that, with the leader of an organization, if you think about how you want to be resilient, that is your opinion. That's what works for you. But that's not fact. Yes. How you define resilience is not going to work for everyone.
It's not fact. And I might perceive something or believe something or look at something as a major challenge and a major stressor in my life, but it's not really. It's something that, with the right social support and with the right resilience tools, and with the right understanding of my traits and how my traits might respond in that environment, I can more likely respond in a healthier way, both for me and for the people around me.
Oh, one final thing as well, I forgot to say, when it comes to the individual, think about what your motives are when you are faced with this difficult situation. Are you looking to mitigate the risks? Are you looking to play it as safe as possible and be able to get through it? Or are you shooting for the rewards? Are you going as high as possible and actually, still looking for that ideal solution, playing it less safe but higher reward? And I think both of those, there's not a right or a wrong answer, but you need to be actually be able to recognize what is the end goal, starting with the end in mind. Do you want to play it safe and get through it? Or do you want to forge ahead and have that kind of high reward circumstance?
Yes. And sometimes that short-term safety can be quite negative longer term.
Mm-hmm.
If we're constantly making shorter term decisions, like what's going to make me feel safe today might not be what's going to be the most beneficial outcome for me and the people around me longer term.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And precisely. It's contextual.
Completely contextual to you and the environment that you're in and the people that are around you. And it's constantly changing. It's evolving.
Absolutely.
Jonathan, this has been an absolute delight. I've really enjoyed talking to someone with your perspective and your insight. So thank you for being a guest on Growth Tales today. And I, like all our listeners, will be very keen to see the results of your research in just a little while.
Just speaking to you today, you've given me probably about 5 more ideas for the research I want to do. So I'm probably going to need to sit down later and be able to sort through it and prioritize what I want to do. Giving me a lot more work.
I'm glad I contributed something to the conversation. But Jonathan, you have a fantastic morning, and
thank you.
I'll have a great evening, and bye for now.
Yeah, it's great speaking to you, Peter.